Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born on August 27, 1770, in Stuttgart, in the Duchy of Württemberg, a small principality within the Holy Roman Empire. His birth coincided with an age of profound upheaval. Enlightenment Europe was in full ferment. Ideas of liberty and reason were spreading, and traditional political structures were beginning to crumble. Hegel grew up in an educated bourgeois family. His father was a civil servant, and his mother, from a literary background, died prematurely when he was only 13. From an early age, he developed a deep passion for reading. He devoured the Greek and Latin classics, as well as the great modern authors. Even then, he displayed an insatiable curiosity for systems of thought, grand intellectual architectures, and a desire to understand the world in its totality. At 18, Hegel entered the Protestant seminary in Tübingen, where he met two figures who would profoundly mark his life: the poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. The three young men shared a dormitory and engaged in endless discussions about freedom, reason, and social transformation. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, these young Germans, though living in a fragmented and conservative land, were thrilled by the events unfolding in Paris. Symbolically, Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling planted a tree of liberty in Tübingen, a discreet yet powerful gesture revealing their enthusiasm for revolutionary ideals. The French Revolution would become a foundational event for Hegel. It embodied the living dialectic of history. The old regime, with its privileges and hierarchies, came into contradiction with the new aspirations for freedom and equality. Out of this tension emerged a radical transformation: the fall of absolute monarchy, the affirmation of human rights, and the birth of a new order. Yet this transformation was not without violence. The terror, the wars, and revolutionary excesses revealed that freedom can turn against itself. From this, Hegel drew a central lesson: history advances through contradictions, conflicts, and resolutions. Freedom is never granted once and for all. It must be conquered, lost, and reconquered in a perpetual dialectical movement. After completing his studies, Hegel worked as a private tutor in aristocratic households and began writing. His early texts focused on religion, politics, and society, exploring how institutions express the spirit of an era. In 1801, he settled in Jena, then the intellectual center of Germany, where he taught and published his first major works. It was there that he wrote his first masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807. Amid dramatic circumstances, the city was occupied by Napoleon's troops after the Battle of Jena. Witnessing Napoleon's entry into the city, Hegel wrote to a friend that he had seen the soul of the world on horseback. This famous phrase captured his sense that Napoleon, at that moment, embodied the unfolding movement of world history. Hegel's life continued in Nuremberg, Heidelberg, and finally Berlin, where he became a professor and the official philosopher of the Prussian state. His lectures attracted large crowds of students fascinated by the scope of his system. Hegel was not a detached thinker. He believed that philosophy must illuminate its own time, that it must be, as he said, its age comprehended in thought. This formula perfectly sums up his ambition: to understand the present not as a series of random events, but as the necessary outcome of a rational historical process. To grasp Hegel's originality, one must understand the intellectual context in which he worked. After Kant, German philosophy was in full effervescence. Kant had shown that human reason cannot know things in themselves, but only phenomena as they appear to us. This critical revolution opened new questions. If we cannot know the world as it is, but only as it appears, what role does the mind play in shaping reality? Fichte answered that the self creates the world. The activity of the subject generates the object. Schelling, in turn, emphasized the unity of nature and spirit. Nature, he said, is another expression of the absolute, just as spirit is. Hegel, finally, sought to move beyond these partial views by constructing a total system, one that would integrate logic, nature, history, art, religion, and philosophy into a single dynamic movement. This ambition might seem immense, but it rested on a profound conviction. What is real is rational, and what is rational is real. This phrase, often misunderstood, does not mean that everything that exists is good or just. It means that everything that exists follows a certain logic, that history is not absurd chaos, but an intelligible process. Even the most violent or contradictory events have their place within a greater movement, the unfolding of freedom itself. The key to this unfolding is dialectics. Unlike Aristotelian logic, which viewed contradiction as impossible, Hegel held that contradiction is the driving force of both thought and history. Every idea, institution, or era contains within itself its own contradictions, which eventually transform it. Dialectics, for Hegel, is not an abstract game. It is the very law of reality. Take a concrete example, the French Revolution. The old regime, thesis, came into conflict with the new ideals of liberty and equality, antithesis. From this tension arose a new order, synthesis, the modern state, which sought to reconcile individual freedom with collective order. But this synthesis, too, contains new contradictions that will give rise to further transformations. Such is history, an endless process of conflict and transcendence. Hegel applied this method to every domain: logic, nature, history, art, religion, and philosophy. In the phenomenology of spirit, he traced the path of consciousness from sense perception to reason through a series of dialectical stages. In the science of logic, he showed how concepts transform into one another through their internal contradictions. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, he interpreted the great events of humanity as moments in the progressive realization of freedom. From the very beginning, Hegel invites us to an intellectual revolution, to see contradiction not as an obstacle, but as a source of movement and understanding. Dialectics becomes the key to interpreting reality, thought, and history itself. Hegel is, without a doubt, the philosopher who most profoundly rehabilitated contradiction. Where the Aristotelian tradition treated the principle of non-contradiction as absolute, it is impossible for something to be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Hegel claimed that contradiction is not an error in thought, but the very engine of thought and reality. This is a conceptual revolution. Contradiction is no longer what must be avoided, but what makes progress possible. In his Science of Logic, Hegel begins with the simplest categories: being and nothing. Pure being, taken by itself, without any determination, is indistinguishable from nothing. Being and nothing, far from excluding one another, actually coincide. Their opposition is so absolute that it cancels itself out. From this contradiction arises a new category, becoming. Thus, from the very first pages of his logic, Hegel shows that thought advances not by avoiding contradictions, but by passing through and transcending them. This dialectical logic unfolds in three moments: an initial position, its opposite, and a higher reconciliation, which Hegel calls Aufhebung, an untranslatable German word meaning at once to cancel, to preserve, and to elevate. It must be emphasized, Hegel never expressed his method in the simplistic formula thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Yet this triadic movement captures the spirit of his thought. Every concept contains within itself its own negation, and from this tension arises a richer concept that both preserves and transcends what came before. For Hegel, contradiction is not only logical, it is ontological. Reality itself is woven through with contradictions. Nature, history, and society evolve because they contain internal tensions. History is not a series of random events, but a rational process in which each epoch generates its own negation and is transcended by a new form. Take a concrete example, the French Revolution. The old regime, initial position, comes into contradiction with the new aspirations to liberty and equality, negation. From this tension emerges a new order, reconciliation, the modern state, which seeks to reconcile individual freedom with collective order. But this synthesis is not final. It carries within itself new contradictions, which will in turn give rise to further transformations. Thus unfolds history, a perpetual movement of contradictions and resolutions. This vision is profoundly dynamic. It breaks with every static conception of truth. For Hegel, truth is not a fixed proposition, but a process. It unfolds through time, through contradictions and their overcoming. To think dialectically is to accept that truth is never given once and for all, but is continually built through movement. Even today, this logic retains remarkable power. In a world marked by deep crises and contradictions, economic, social, ecological, dialectical thinking invites us not to see these tensions as dead ends, but as engines of transformation. Contradiction is not the end. It is the beginning of transcendence. The Hegelian dialectic is often summarized by a simplified formula: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This triad has become a cliché, a pedagogical shortcut, yet it does not accurately reflect how Hegel himself presented his thought. Still, it captures something essential: the idea that both thought and reality advance through contradictions and their resolutions. To truly grasp this movement, we must enter the heart of Hegel's method, Aufhebung, that untranslatable German word meaning at once to cancel, to preserve, and to elevate. Aufhebung is the driving force of the dialectic. Every concept, institution, and historical moment carries within itself an internal contradiction. This contradiction does not simply destroy it. It propels it beyond itself. The process of transcendence cancels what was one-sided, preserves what was true, and elevates the whole to a richer form. It is this movement that can, in a schematic way, be represented by the triad: an initial position, thesis, its negation, antithesis, and its transcendence, synthesis. But we must remember that the dialectic is not an external framework imposed on reality. It is the inner movement of reality itself. Let us take a simple example from the science of logic. Hegel begins with the most abstract category: pure being. Pure being, without determination, without quality, without relation, is indistinguishable from nothingness. Being and nothing, far from excluding one another, coincide in their indeterminacy. From this contradiction arises a new category: becoming. Becoming is not the mere addition of being and nothing. It is their transcendence, their Aufhebung. It cancels their abstract indeterminacy, preserves their fundamental intuition, and elevates thought to a richer form. This small logical example illustrates the Hegelian method. Each concept, when pushed to its limits, reveals its insufficiency, gives rise to its opposite, and demands to be transcended. The dialectic is not a static chain of definitions. It is a living movement, a drama of meaning. Now, let us apply this logic to history. The Ancien regime, with its privileges and hierarchies, represents a thesis. The French Revolution, proclaiming universal liberty and equality, serves as its antithesis. But this abstract freedom turns into terror, for it negates all particularity. From this contradiction arises a synthesis, the modern state, which seeks to reconcile individual freedom with collective order. This synthesis, of course, is not final. It carries within itself new contradictions that will give birth to further transformations. History thus advances through crises and transcendences, through successive Aufhebungen. The dialectic is not only logical or historical, it is existential. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the journey of consciousness. Since certainty believes it grasps the immediate, only to find that immediacy slips away. It rises to perception, then to understanding, and finally to self-consciousness. Each stage believes itself sufficient. Each stage refutes itself. The famous dialectic of master and slave illustrates this. The master thinks himself dominant, yet depends on the recognition of the slave. The slave, through labor, transforms the world and himself, discovering a deeper freedom. Contradiction, for Hegel, is not failure. It is the engine of the consciousness's progress. Aufhebung, then, is an intimate experience. It teaches us to work with our opposites. Each of us carries inner theses, values, habits, visions, and antitheses, doubts, critiques, experiences that shatter them. We become truly mature only when we dare to form a personal synthesis, one that does not betray what we once cherished, yet no longer confines us within it. Dialectic is not fate. It is courage, the courage to be transformed without being dissolved. This logic can be extended to art, religion, and philosophy. Art reveals truth in a sensible form. Religion elevates that truth into the form of representation. Philosophy, finally, expresses truth in the form of the concept. Philosophy does not destroy art or religion. It transcends them, preserving their truth in a higher, more conscious form. That too is Aufhebung, to cancel, to preserve, to elevate. Even today, the dialectical triad remains profoundly relevant. In a polarized world that endlessly opposes irreconcilable theses and antitheses, dialectic invites us to seek living syntheses. It teaches us that truth does not belong to one side alone, but to the movement that reconciles opposites. It reminds us that contradictions are not dead ends. They are opportunities for growth. Hegel is not merely a philosopher of abstract logic. He is also a thinker of history, and it is perhaps there that his dialectic reveals its full power. For Hegel, history is not a chaotic sequence of events, a random succession of accidents or catastrophes, but a rational process, a movement that has meaning. That meaning is the progressive unfolding of freedom. Universal history, in his famous formula, is the progress of the consciousness of freedom. This idea is crucial, for it gives history direction and intelligibility, allowing us to understand crises and conflicts not as absurd accidents, but as necessary stages in a greater unfolding. In the ancient Eastern world, only one person, the despot, was free. In ancient Greece and Rome, some men were free, but not all. Slaves, women, and foreigners were excluded. In the modern world, finally, the idea emerges that all human beings are free. This progress is not linear. It unfolds through violence and contradiction, yet it is real. Each era, each civilization, each institution contains within itself tensions that drive it to transcend itself. History advances through crises, conflicts, and successive Aufhebungen, those moments of cancellation, preservation, and elevation. The French Revolution, for Hegel, is a quintessential example of this process. As a student in Tübingen, he followed its events with enthusiasm. Later, he would describe it as a magnificent sunrise, a dawn of freedom. The revolution embodies the living dialectic of history. The Ancien regime, with its privileges and hierarchies, represents the thesis. The revolution, proclaiming universal liberty and equality, serves as its antithesis. Yet this abstract freedom turns into terror, for it denies all particularity. From this contradiction arises a synthesis, the modern state, which seeks to reconcile individual freedom with collective order. This synthesis does not emerge immediately. It passes through trials, through violence, through negations, but it illustrates the dialectical logic. An idea, when pushed to its extreme, generates its own negation, and from that tension a richer form is born. Hegel insists that the terror was not an accident, but a necessary moment. Abstract freedom, which denies all difference, turns into its opposite, violence. This paradox exposes the limits of purely formal liberty and prepares the way for a concrete freedom embodied in stable institutions. The French Revolution is thus both a triumph and a tragedy, a dawn and a night, but above all, a dialectical moment that propels history forward. For Hegel, the modern state is the synthesis of these contradictions. It is not merely an administrative machine, but the incarnation of freedom made objective. In the state, individual freedom and the universality of law are reconciled. The individual is neither crushed by the community nor isolated within private self-interest. He finds his freedom within institutions that protect both his rights and the common good. The modern state, in this sense, is an Aufhebung. It cancels one-sidedness, preserves achievements, and elevates the whole to a richer form. Hegel applies this logic to world history. Each civilization is a moment in the unfolding of spirit. The Orient embodies unity, but at the price of servitude. Greece embodies the beauty of freedom, but limited to an elite. Rome embodies the rigor of law, but at the price of alienation. Christianity introduces the idea of universal human dignity, but in a religious form. Modernity realizes this idea within political and legal institutions. Each civilization, then, is a thesis that generates its antithesis and transcends itself in a synthesis. Universal history is a succession of Aufhebungen, in which each age both preserves and surpasses the previous ones. The strength of Hegel's dialectic lies in showing that contradictions are not accidents, but engines of development. The French Revolution was not an arbitrary rupture. It was the outcome of the internal contradictions of the Ancien regime. The terror was not an aberration. It was the product of the contradictions of abstract freedom. History advances because contradictions drive societies to surpass themselves. This vision is demanding, for it forces us to see crises not merely as catastrophes, but as opportunities for transformation. It invites us to look behind conflicts and discern the logic that animates them. It reminds us that progress is not linear, but dialectical. It moves through negations, trials, and transcendences. Even today, this conception remains strikingly relevant. In a world torn by economic, social, and ecological crises, dialectical thinking urges us not to see contradictions as dead ends, but as engines of transformation. The ecological crisis, for example, exposes the contradictions of the productivist model. It calls for an Aufhebung, a synthesis that preserves the achievements of modernity, science, technology, freedom, while transcending them toward a more harmonious relationship with nature. Likewise, the social and political tensions of our time can be read dialectically. They reveal the limits of our institutions and call for new transcendences. Dialectic is not a formula, but a method. It teaches us to see in contradictions the seeds of progress. Hegel thus invites us to a double attitude, lucidity and hope. Lucidity, because we must recognize that contradictions are inevitable, that crises are necessary, that the negative is part of reality. Hope, because we must remember that these contradictions are not dead ends, but engines of growth, that crises open the path to transcendence, that history advances toward greater freedom. For Hegel, universal history is not chaos, but a symphony. Each era, Each civilization, each event is a note in that symphony, sometimes dissonant, yet necessary to the harmony of the whole. Dialectic is the key that allows us to understand this music of reality. It teaches us to listen to dissonances, to move through them, to transform them into harmony. It reminds us that truth is never given once and for all. It is built over time, through contradictions and their resolutions. Thus, dialectic in history is a lesson in wisdom. It teaches us not to despair in the face of crises, not to fear contradictions, not to flee the negative. It invites us to see in every conflict an opportunity for progress, in every trial a necessary stage, in every negation a promise of transcendence. It reminds us that history is the path of freedom, and that this path, though winding and painful, advances inexorably toward a deeper and more universal consciousness of liberty. Hegel is not only the philosopher of universal history, he is also the thinker of the intimate experience of consciousness. In his great early work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, he sets out to describe the path the human mind takes to attain absolute knowing. This path is not a straight line, but a series of dialectical stages, in which each form of consciousness believes itself complete, encounters its own contradictions, and transcends itself into a richer form. Dialectic is not merely a logic of concepts or a dynamic of collective history. It is also the driving force of inner life, the process by which self-consciousness is formed. Consciousness begins with sense certainty. It believes it grasps the immediate, the this, the now, the here. But this immediacy slips away. The now becomes a then, the here turns into an elsewhere. Sense certainty, which thought itself absolute, reveals its poverty. It transcends itself into perception, which organizes the manifold into things endowed with qualities. Yet perception meets its own contradictions. Qualities conflict, things divide, unity breaks apart. Consciousness then rises to understanding, which posits forces and laws behind phenomena. But understanding, too, reaches its limits. Forces are abstractions, laws are generalities, and the singularity of the real escapes its grasp. Thus, step by step, consciousness advances by negating itself. Each stage is a thesis that generates its antithesis and transcends itself in a synthesis. Yet every synthesis becomes, in turn, a new thesis, producing a fresh antithesis, and so on. The dialectic is an infinite movement, a spiraling ascent. The decisive moment comes when consciousness becomes self-consciousness. It no longer merely perceives objects. It recognizes itself as subject. But this recognition is not immediate. It comes through struggle. Here appears Hegel's famous passage of the master and the slave. Two self-conscious beings encounter one another. Each seeks to be recognized by the other as a free consciousness. This struggle for recognition can become so intense that it turns into a battle to the death. Yet if one consciousness dies, recognition vanishes. Both must survive. Thus, one accepts submission, becoming the slave, while the other dominates, becoming the master. At first glance, the master appears victorious. He receives recognition from the slave and enjoys the fruits of the other's labor. But that recognition is one-sided. It comes from a dependent being and thus has no true value. The master remains bound to the slave. The slave, however, discovers in work an unsuspected power. By transforming nature, he transforms himself. Through labor, he learns patience, discipline, and mediation. He finds freedom in creative activity. Gradually, dependence is reversed. The master, who does not work, remains imprisoned in immediate enjoyment. The slave, who works, attains a deeper freedom. This reversal is a perfect example of Aufhebung. Servitude is negated as deprivation, preserved as formative experience, and elevated into the power of subjectivity. The dialectic of master and slave is not merely an analysis of domination. It is a parable of the human condition. It shows that freedom is not won in immediacy, but through mediation, through labor, through mutual recognition. It shows that contradiction is not a failure, but a motor of development. Consciousness continues its ascent. It becomes reason, then spirit, then religion, and finally absolute knowing. At each stage, it encounters its own limits and transcends them. Reason discovers that it cannot explain everything by itself, that it needs history and culture. Spirit discovers that it cannot close itself within a single community, that it must open to the universal. Religion discovers that it cannot remain in representations, that it must rise to conceptual thought. Absolute knowing, finally, is not a static end but the consciousness of this movement itself. The dialectic within consciousness is, therefore, a pedagogy. It teaches us that truth is not given once and for all, but constructed through time, through contradictions and their transcendence. It teaches us that freedom is not immediate, but won through mediation, through work, through recognition. It teaches us that the negative is not an obstacle, but a force. Even today, this lesson retains its power. In our personal lives, we experience contradictions, crises, negations. We believe we have found certainty, and it dissolves. We think we have achieved stability, and it cracks. Yet these trials are not dead ends. They are opportunities for transcendence. They compel us to grow, to change, to elevate ourselves. The dialectic of consciousness is a lesson in resilience. It reminds us that truth unfolds in time, that freedom is forged through struggle, that recognition is the heart of humanity. Thus, Hegel invites us to see our inner contradictions not as failures, but as engines. He invites us to embrace the negative, to pass through crises, to seek synthesis. He reminds us that consciousness is a journey, and that this journey is dialectical. Hegel left such a deep mark on philosophy that no thinker after him could ignore his presence. His system, his dialectic, and his vision of history and consciousness have inspired both fertile legacies and fierce criticisms. This chapter is devoted to that dual dimension. On one hand, the vast posterity of Hegel's thought. On the other, the persistent objections it has provoked. Hegel's influence was first felt directly among his contemporaries and disciples. After his death in 1831, his students split into two camps, the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians. The former, more radical, saw in the dialectic a tool for social and political critique. They sought to extend Hegel's philosophy toward democracy, atheism, and revolution. The latter, more conservative, emphasized reconciling Hegelian philosophy with the Prussian state and religion. This division already shows that the dialectic is a double-edged sword. It can serve to justify the established order as well as to challenge it. The most famous of the young Hegelians is Karl Marx. Marx took up Hegel's dialectic but inverted it. In Hegel, he said, the dialectic stands on its head. It is idealist, making spirit the driving force of history. Marx wanted to set it back on its feet. History, he argued, is driven not by ideas but by material conditions, relations of production, and class struggle. The dialectic becomes materialist. Its contradictions are no longer those of concepts, but of the economy and society. The struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat is the modern equivalent of the struggle between master and slave. Marx thus kept the dialectical structure but changed its substance. He criticized Hegel's idealism but acknowledged his debt to him. Without Hegel, there would be no materialist dialectic, no Marxism. Another critical heir was Soren Kierkegaard. For him, Hegel's system was too totalizing, too abstract, neglecting the concrete individual. Kierkegaard accused Hegel of dissolving singular existence into the universal spirit. Truth, he claimed, lies not in the system, but in lived existence, in choice, in anguish, in faith. Where Hegel saw universal history, Kierkegaard saw the individual standing before God. His critique was radical. It opposed living subjectivity to the objectivity of the system. Yet it also demonstrated Hegel's fecundity, for in opposing him, Kierkegaard laid the groundwork for existentialism. Later, Nietzsche too attacked Hegel. He saw in the dialectic a logic of reconciliation and rationalization that stifles life. For Nietzsche, contradiction is not something to be resolved in synthesis. It must be embraced in its cruelty and strength. The will to power seeks not harmony, but affirmation. Nietzsche rejected Hegel, yet in a paradoxical way extended him by radicalizing the negative. In the 20th century, Hegel's dialectic continued to inspire. Thinkers of the Frankfurt School, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, adopted the dialectic to critique modern society, but emphasized its negative aspect. Adorno spoke of a negative dialectic. He refused the idea of a reconciliatory synthesis, insisting instead on keeping contradiction open, as a wound that prevents complacency with the world as it is. Again, Hegel served as both model and foil. The criticisms of Hegel are many. He is reproached for his obscurity, his difficult style, his endless sentences. He is faulted for his systematism, his ambition to encompass all reality within a single framework. He is accused of speculative excess and of justifying the established order by presenting it as rational. Kierkegaard, as we have seen, denounced his neglect of the individual. Marx condemned his idealism. Nietzsche rejected his reconciliatory spirit. The positivists of the 19th century, like Kant, dismissed his metaphysics in the name of science. The existentialists of the 20th century, like Sartre, challenged his system in the name of freedom. And yet, despite all these critiques, Hegel remains inescapable. Even those who reject him must pass through him. His dialectic opened an intellectual horizon that no one can ignore. It revealed that contradiction is the motor of reality, that truth is a process, and that history has meaning. He gave philosophy an immense ambition, to think the whole, to think movement, to think freedom. Thus, Hegel's legacy is double. On one hand, he inspired entire movements: Marxism, existentialism, phenomenology, critical theory. On the other, he provoked critiques that have shaped modern philosophy itself. Hegel stands as both master and adversary, model and countermodel. His dialectic remains an inexhaustible source, one that can be taken up, transformed, challenged, but never ignored. The Hegelian dialectic is not a relic of the past, nor a mere curiosity for historians of philosophy. It remains a living method, one capable of illuminating the contradictions of our contemporary world. Hegel taught us that contradiction is not a dead end, but a driving force, and that lesson is perhaps more urgent today than ever. We live in an age saturated with crises: ecological, social, political, and technological. Each of these crises can be read dialectically, not as an end, but as a stage, a negation that calls for a higher reconciliation. Take the ecological crisis, for instance. It exposes the internal contradictions of the productivist model inherited from modernity. On one hand, science and technology have enabled humanity to unleash immense forces, to transform nature, to increase wealth and freedom. On the other hand, that same power now threatens the planet, destroys ecological balance, and endangers the very future of humankind. The contradiction is stark. The freedom achieved through the mastery of nature turns into servitude as we become prisoners of our own excesses. Yet this contradiction can be read dialectically. It calls for an Aufhebung, a synthesis that preserves the achievements of modernity, science, technology, freedom, while transcending them toward a more harmonious relationship with nature. The ecological crisis is not merely a catastrophe. It is also an opportunity for transformation, an invitation to reinvent our relationship with the world. The social and political crisis, too, can be understood dialectically. Modern societies rest upon the idea of individual freedom and universal rights. But that very freedom collides with growing inequalities, exclusions, and divisions. Here lies the contradiction. The proclaimed universal negates itself in the reality of injustice. This contradiction gives rise to protest movements, demands, and struggles. It may lead to violence or paralysis, but it can also open the way to a synthesis, a more just society that preserves individual freedom while making it truly effective for all. Once again, the dialectic teaches us to see crisis not as a dead end, but as a motor of progress. Technology, finally, provides a particularly vivid field for contemporary dialectics. The digital revolution, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology are transforming our lives at a dizzying pace. On one hand, they offer unprecedented possibilities: communication, knowledge, health, creativity. On the other, they generate dependence, alienation, and threats to privacy, employment, and democracy. The contradiction is clear. The power that liberates is also the one that enslaves. Yet this contradiction, too, can be overcome by seeking a synthesis that preserves the achievements of technology while orienting them toward the common good. The dialectic invites us to avoid both catastrophism and naive optimism, and instead to seek transcendence through reason. Dialectics, then, is a method for thinking about the present. It teaches us not to flee from contradictions, nor to deny them, but to move through them. It reminds us that truth is not given once and for all. It is built over time, through crises and their resolutions. It encourages us to see in conflicts not endings, but beginnings. Today, in a polarized world where irreconcilable theses and antitheses constantly clash, dialectical thinking is a school of maturity. It teaches us that truth does not reside entirely in one side, but in the overcoming of opposition. It reminds us that freedom is not a possession, but a process. It invites us to think of the present not as a blockage, but as a stage in a larger movement. Thus, the relevance of dialectics today is immense. It is a method for understanding our crises, for enduring them, and for transcending them. It is a lesson in lucidity and hope. Lucidity, because it forces us to recognize contradictions and confront the negative. Hope, because it reminds us that contradictions are not impasses but engines of progress, that the negative is a creative force, and that history moves forward. Hegel has accompanied us throughout this journey, from the logic of contradiction to the unfolding of universal history, from the intimate experience of consciousness to the structures of collective life. This final section is a conclusion, but not a closure. It is a moment of elevation, a breath that allows us to grasp what dialectics teaches us about truth, freedom, and our relation to the world. The first lesson of Hegel is that truth is not a static datum, but a process. It is not a fixed block of certainty, but a living movement. Truth unfolds through time, through contradictions and their resolutions. As Hegel said, the true is not an immediate identity, but an identity that is reconstructed through difference, a unity that passes through negation before finding itself again. Truth is dialectical. It includes the negative, feeds on contradiction, and manifests itself in becoming. The second lesson is that freedom is not a state, but a path. It is not given once and for all. It is won, lost, and won again. It realizes itself in history, in institutions, in consciousness. Freedom is not the abstract liberty of doing whatever one wishes, but the concrete liberty of recognizing oneself in a rational order, in a community where each is free because all are free. Freedom, too, is dialectical. It is born from conflict, forged in struggle, and elevated in reconciliation. The third lesson is that the negative is not an obstacle, but a force. We tend to fear contradictions, to flee from crises, to dread trials. Hegel teaches us to welcome them. Contradiction is the motor of reality. Crisis is a necessary passage, and trial is an opportunity for transcendence. The negative is painful, but it is fertile. It tears us away from immediacy, compels us to grow, and urges us to rise. The fourth lesson is that history has meaning. It is not a chaotic absurdity, but a rational process. It moves toward greater freedom, toward an ever more universal consciousness. This progress is not linear. It proceeds through detours, setbacks, and tragedies. Yet it is real. Each era, each civilization, each event is a moment of this process. History is dialectical. It advances through contradictions, crises, and reconciliations. The fifth lesson is that philosophy is our epic grasped in thought. To think is not to flee the world, but to comprehend it. It is not to drift into abstraction, but to grasp the rationality within the real. Philosophy is no idle luxury. It is a necessity. It allows us to understand our time, to discern its contradictions, and to seek their transcendence. It is a school of lucidity and hope. Thus, Hegel's lesson is clear. Truth is a process. Freedom is a journey. The negative is a force. History has meaning, and philosophy is our guide. Dialectics is not merely a method. It is the breathing of reality itself. It teaches us to see in contradictions not dead ends but engines, in crises not endings but beginnings, in trials not obstacles but opportunities for elevation. Hegel invites us to a demanding wisdom. He promises no immediate peace, offers no easy certainties. He calls us to pass through the negative, to embrace contradiction, to seek synthesis. He reminds us that freedom is built through time, that truth unfolds through becoming, that history advances through crises and transcendence. The conclusion, for Hegel, is not an end but an opening. It invites us to continue the path, to pursue the dialectic, to seek truth in movement, freedom in reconciliation, and meaning in history. It reminds us that to think is to live contradiction, and to live is to transcend oneself. Such is Hegel's ultimate lesson. The dialectic is the law of the real, and it is our task as well. It is up to us to assume it, to live it, to carry it forward. Thank you.